Oh, the invitation. The clock had just struck 11 when Alina crossed the lobby of the Blackwood Grand Hotel, her black velvet dress trailing behind her like whispered secrets, and the silver chains around her neck catching the dim light of ancient chandeliers that had witnessed 1,000 midnight meetings just like this one. She had received the invitation 3 days ago, written on paper so old it crumbled at the edges, sealed with crimson wax that smelled faintly of roses and something darker, something that made her heart race in a way she could never explain to anyone who asked. The message was simple, almost painfully so, containing only an address, a time, and a single sentence that had kept her awake for 2 straight nights wondering what it could possibly mean. I have waited 400 years to ask you one question. Alina had known Damien Voronov for exactly 2 years, though she suspected he had known of her existence far longer than she could imagine, perhaps even before she was born, before her mother was born, before the very foundations of the city she called home were laid into the earth by hands that had long since turned to dust. They had met at a small Gothic bookshop on the corner of Ravens Street, a place where the living and the dead came together in quiet understanding, where the candles never seemed to burn down and the owner never seemed to age. She had been reaching for a collection of poetry by Edgar Allan Poe when his cold fingers brushed against hers, and in that moment she felt something ancient and powerful stir within her chest like a sleeping dragon awakening after centuries of slumber. He had apologized immediately, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, smooth as aged wine and dark as the moonless sky outside the window. And when she looked into his eyes, she saw not just the reflection of the candlelight, but entire lifetimes spinning within their depths like galaxies being born and dying in the same eternal breath. Most people would have run from such an encounter, would have sensed the danger that radiated from his pale skin and perfect stillness. But Alina was not most people, and she had spent her entire life feeling like an outsider, like someone who belonged to a world that existed just beyond the veil of ordinary existence. Instead of running, she smiled at him, and in that smile she offered something she had never offered anyone before: acceptance without question, understanding without demand. Now, as she approached the elevator that would take her to the penthouse suite where he waited, Alina felt the weight of every moment they had shared pressing down upon her shoulders like a crown made of shadows and starlight. She remembered the night he told her the truth about what he was, how his hands trembled as he waited for her to scream or flee or call him a monster, as so many others had done throughout his impossibly long existence. She remembered how she had taken those trembling hands in her own, kissed each finger one by one, and told him that monsters were not defined by what they were born as but by the choices they made when no one was watching. She remembered the single tear that had fallen from his ancient eyes, blood-red and precious, the first tear he had shed in over 300 years. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that echoed through the marble hallway like a calling bell summoning souls to judgment, and Alina stepped out onto carpet so thick and rich that her footsteps made no sound at all, as if the very building understood that some moments required perfect silence to be truly appreciated. The hallway stretched before her, lined with paintings of landscapes that no longer existed and portraits of people whose names had been forgotten by history, but whose eyes seemed to follow her with knowing curiosity as she walked past them toward the double doors at the very end. Her heart was beating so loudly now that she was certain Damien could hear it from inside the room, could count each rapid pulse and know exactly how nervous and excited and terrified she felt all at once. What Alina did not know, what she could not possibly have known as she raised her hand to knock on those ancient oak doors, was that Damien Voronov was not the only one waiting for her on the other side, and that this night would change everything she believed about love, about sacrifice, and about the true meaning of forever. Inside that penthouse suite, a war was being waged in silence, a battle between tradition and transformation, between the old ways of his kind and the new hope that Alina represented not just for him, but for every creature of the night who had ever dared to dream of something more than an existence defined by hunger and solitude. Damien stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker like dying stars far below, his hands clasped behind his back in that formal posture that revealed his aristocratic upbringing in a world where kings still ruled by divine right and blood-determined destiny. Behind him, seated on an antique sofa that had once belonged to a Russian empress, was the Council of Elders, 5 ancient vampires whose combined age exceeded 4,000 years and whose power could level cities if they chose to unleash it. They had come uninvited, as was their right according to laws written in blood before the rise and fall of empires, and they had come with one purpose only: to prevent the vampire king from doing something they considered unforgivable. She approaches, the eldest of them spoke, her voice like wind through dead leaves, her eyes like frozen amber containing the memories of countless centuries. This human girl you have chosen over the traditions of your ancestors, over the bloodlines that have sustained our kind through plagues and wars and the endless turning of ages. Damien did not turn to face her, did not give her the satisfaction of seeing the fury that burned behind his carefully controlled expression, because he knew that tonight required more than anger, more than the power he had accumulated through centuries of cunning and patience. Tonight required love, and love, he had learned in his 2 short years with Alina, was the most powerful force in any universe. She is not just a human girl, Damien replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging within his undead heart. She is the reason I finally understand why immortality was given to me, not as a curse but as a gift, a chance to wait until she was born, until she was ready, until the universe aligned in such a way that our paths could finally cross. The elders exchanged glances filled with disgust and something that might have been fear, because a vampire king who believed in love was dangerous, unpredictable, capable of destroying everything they had built over millennia in pursuit of something as fragile and temporary as human emotion. The knock on the door echoed through the room like thunder, and everyone inside fell silent, waiting, watching, as Damien finally turned from the window and walked toward the entrance with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who knew that the next few moments would determine not just his fate, but the fate of an entire species hidden in the shadows of human civilization. The proposal. Alina stepped into the penthouse suite expecting romance and candlelight, expecting Damien's arms to wrap around her in that cold embrace that somehow always made her feel warmer than any fire ever could. But what she found instead was a room filled with tension so thick she could taste it on her tongue like copper and fear. 5 figures sat motionless on the furniture, their eyes fixed upon her with expressions that ranged from open hostility to curious examination. And though she had never met any of them before, she knew immediately what they were by the way the very air seemed to grow heavier in their presence. These were ancient ones, beings who had walked the earth when pyramids were still being built and gods were still worshipped in temples of gold, and they were looking at her like she was an insect that had wandered into a den of lions. Damien moved to her side instantly, placing himself between her and the council in a gesture of protection that spoke louder than any words could have, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently as if to say that no matter what happened next, he would never let any harm come to her. Alina squeezed back, drawing courage from his touch, reminding herself that she had faced bullies and doubt in a world that never seemed to understand her all her life, and she had survived every single challenge through nothing more than stubbornness and the refusal to become someone she was not. So this is the human who has bewitched our king, one of the elders spoke, rising from his seat with fluid grace that seemed to defy gravity itself. This painted creature with silver in her hair and rebellion in her eyes, this mortal girl who thinks she can stand among immortals as an equal. Alina felt her fear transforming into something harder, something sharper, something that had carried her through years of being called strange and weird and too different to belong anywhere normal. She stepped forward, past Damien's protective stance, and faced the elder directly, refusing to lower her gaze even though every instinct screamed at her to run. I have never claimed to be equal to beings who have lived for centuries, Alina spoke, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But I have also never believed that age alone determines worth, or that power gives anyone the right to decide who another person is allowed to love. The room fell into stunned silence, because no human had ever dared to speak to the council in such a manner, had ever possessed the courage or perhaps the foolishness to challenge beings who could end their existence with nothing more than a thought. Damien felt pride swell within his chest, fierce and overwhelming, because this was exactly why he had chosen her, exactly why he had waited 400 years for someone who would stand beside him rather than behind him. You speak of love, the eldest female elder said, rising now as well, her ancient power crackling through the room like lightning before a storm. But what do you truly know of love, child, when you cannot even begin to comprehend what it means to watch everyone you care about wither and die while you remain unchanged, century after century, until the very concept of attachment becomes a source of unbearable pain rather than comfort? Alina considered the question carefully, understanding that this was not merely an interrogation but a test, a chance to prove that she had thought about these things deeply rather than stumbling blindly into a romance that could destroy her. I know that love is not about avoiding pain, Alina answered slowly, choosing each word with care. Love is about deciding that someone is worth every tear you will ever shed, every night you will spend afraid, every moment of uncertainty and sacrifice and growth that comes with choosing to open your heart completely to another person. She paused, looking at Damien with eyes full of the devotion she had never been able to express fully in words. I may not live forever, but the love I feel for him will last longer than my body, longer than my memory, longer than anything physical that eventually fades away. Damien moved then, sinking to one knee before Alina with a grace that took her breath away, and in his hand appeared a small velvet box that seemed to contain starlight itself, glowing faintly with an otherworldly luminescence that made the elders gasp in recognition. Inside the box was a ring unlike anything Alina had ever seen, a band of pure obsidian carved with symbols older than language, set with a stone that shifted colors like aurora borealis captured and crystallized into something permanent and precious. This was not merely jewelry but an artifact of immense power, a binding stone that had not been used in over 1,000 years because no vampire had ever found a human worthy of its protection. Elena Marie Blackwood, Damien spoke, his ancient voice breaking with emotion for the first time in centuries. I have lived long enough to watch empires rise and fall, to see humanity grow from scattered tribes into civilizations that reach toward the stars, to experience every pleasure and every sorrow that existence has to offer. He looked up at her with eyes that held the weight of 400 years of loneliness finally coming to an end. But in all that time, I never truly lived until I met you. Never understood why I was given this endless existence until you smiled at me in that dusty bookshop and showed me that there was still beauty left in a world I had grown tired of watching. The elders began to protest, their voices rising in outrage and warning, speaking of laws that could not be broken and consequences that would follow if the vampire king insisted on this unprecedented union. But Damien ignored them completely. His entire world narrowed down to the woman standing before him with tears streaming down her face. Alina dropped to her knees as well, taking his face in her hands, looking into those ancient eyes that had seen so much suffering and finding within them a hope so fragile and so precious that it made her heart ache with the need to protect it at any cost. Ask me, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thundering of her own heartbeat. Ask me the question you have waited 400 years to ask. Damien smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his stern features into something almost human, something young and vulnerable and desperately in love. And in that moment, Alina saw not the powerful vampire king, but simply a man who had finally found his home after wandering alone through endless centuries of darkness. But before the words could leave his lips, the penthouse doors exploded inward with tremendous force, and through the smoke and debris stepped a figure that made even the ancient elders shrink back in fear. A vampire so old that he had been ancient when they themselves were young. A monster who had been locked away for 500 years because even his own kind found him too dangerous to walk free among the living or the dead. Did someone forget to invite me to the party? The newcomer asked, his smile revealing fangs stained black by the blood of countless victims, his eyes holding nothing but hunger and madness and an ancient grudge against the Voronov bloodline that demanded satisfaction. Oh, the joys! The vampire who called himself Lazarus stood in the doorway of the penthouse suite like death itself had taken physical form to collect what was owed to him by the universe. And Alina felt cold fear wash through her veins as she realized that everything she thought she understood about danger, and power had been mere shadows compared to the terrible reality now standing before her. He was not merely old, not simply ancient in the way Damien and the council elders were ancient, but something beyond even those categories, a being who had existed when the world was still young, and humans were nothing more than frightened animals huddling in caves while monsters roamed freely across the darkened earth. Damien rose slowly, positioning his body between Alina and the newcomer with the careful movements of someone who understood exactly how outmatched he truly was, but refused to show fear regardless of the consequences. He had heard stories of Lazarus throughout his entire existence, whispered warnings passed down through generations of vampires, tales of a creature so twisted by millennia of solitude and madness that he had become something other than vampire, something that even the oldest among them feared to name aloud lest speaking of him somehow draw his attention. You were supposed to remain sealed for another 500 years, Damien spoke, his voice betraying none of the terror that gripped his heart. The chains that bound you were forged by the combined power of 7 elders at the height of their strength, anchored by magic older than civilizations themselves. Lazarus laughed at this, a sound like breaking glass and screaming children, and stepped further into the room with casual arrogance that came from knowing absolutely nothing in this place could truly threaten him. Chains rust, boy king, Lazarus replied, his black eyes sweeping across the room until they settled on Alina with an interest that made her stomach turn. And magic fades over time like everything else in this tired old universe. Everything except hunger and hatred and the burning need for vengeance against those who dared to lock me away because they feared what I might become if left unchecked. The council elders had risen now, forming a protective circle with Damien at its center, their ancient powers flickering to life like candles trying to hold back an approaching hurricane. Alina watched all of this unfold with the strange clarity that comes to people in moments of extreme danger, when time seems to slow down and every detail becomes permanently etched into memory. And she understood with sudden terrible insight that the beings she had been so afraid of moments ago were themselves now terrified of something far worse than themselves. She also understood with equal clarity that Damien would die trying to protect her if she did nothing, would throw himself against this monster again and again, until finally his ancient body could no longer regenerate, and she would be forced to watch the man she loved destroyed because he valued her life above his own. "What do you want?" Alina called out, stepping past Damien's protective stance despite his desperate attempt to hold her back, because she had learned long ago that running from problems never solved them, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was face their fear directly even when every logical thought screamed for retreat. Lazarus turned his terrible attention to her fully, and she felt the weight of his ancient gaze pressing down upon her like physical force, like gravity itself had increased tenfold around her small human body. "What a curious little creature you are," Lazarus murmured, genuine interest flickering behind the madness in his eyes. "Standing before me when even the oldest among my kind tremble at my approach, speaking to me like an equal when you are nothing more than a heartbeat wrapped in fragile flesh." He moved closer, impossibly fast, until he stood directly before her, his cold breath washing over her face as he leaned down to examine her more closely. "Perhaps I understand now why the young king values you so highly, why he would risk angering the council and breaking ancient traditions for such a delicate mortal thing. She has nothing to do with your grievance against our bloodline," Damien spoke urgently, his voice cracking with desperation as he watched the monster circle his beloved like a predator examining prey. "If vengeance is what you seek, then take it from me. Take my life and my power and whatever else you require to consider your debt paid, but leave her unharmed because she is innocent in all of this." Lazarus seemed to consider this offer, tilting his head with the curious gesture of a bird contemplating an unusual sight, and for one terrible moment, Alina thought he might actually accept the trade. "Your life would give me perhaps a moment of satisfaction," Lazarus said finally, dismissing the offer with a wave of his pale hand. "But your suffering, watching me drain this human of every precious drop while you are held helpless by my power, that would give me centuries of pleasure to remember in the lonely darkness between meals. Oh, he turned back to Alina, reaching out to touch her face with fingers that felt like ice and death itself. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened that none of them expected. The ring that Damien had presented, still clutched in Alina's trembling hand, began to glow with blinding intensity, the ancient binding stone recognizing the threat to its intended bearer and awakening powers that had lain dormant for over 1,000 years. Lazarus screamed in genuine agony as the light touched his skin, stumbling backward with smoke rising from his flesh, and Alina felt something vast and ancient rushing through her body like a river that had finally been freed from a dam. She spoke then, but the voice that emerged from her throat was not entirely her own, layered with echoes of every woman who had ever worn the binding stone before, every mortal who had been deemed worthy of standing beside an immortal king. You speak of hunger and hatred as though they are the only forces that matter in this universe, the voices said through Alina's mouth, but love and sacrifice have always been stronger, always endured longer, always found ways to triumph over even the darkest powers. The light exploded outward from the ring, filling the entire penthouse suite with radiance so pure that it seemed to burn away the very concept of darkness. And when it finally faded, Lazarus was gone, not destroyed but banished back to whatever prison he had escaped from, bound by chains of light that would hold for another 1,000 years at least. Alina collapsed into Damien's arms. Exhausted by channeling power her mortal body was never designed to contain, but alive, wonderfully and miraculously alive. Damien held her close, tears of blood streaming down his ancient face, and whispered the words he had waited 4 centuries to speak. Will you marry me, Alina Blackwood, and walk beside me through whatever eternities await us? Alina smiled weakly, her fingers finding his face, tracing the features she had come to love more than anything else in all the world. Yes, she whispered, I will marry you, Damien Voronov, and together we will prove that love truly is the most powerful force in any universe. The council elders watched in stunned silence as the vampire king slipped the binding ring onto his human beloved's finger, knowing that everything had changed in ways they could not yet fully comprehend, knowing that the old order was finally coming to an end and something new and unprecedented was being born in its place. And somewhere far away, in the darkness between worlds where Lazarus now waited and plotted his eventual return, a new hatred was growing alongside the old, a burning need for vengeance not just against the Voronov bloodline, but against the mortal woman who had humiliated him and the love that had somehow proven stronger than his ancient power. But that was a battle for another day, another story yet to unfold in the endless turning of the cosmic wheel. And for now, in this moment, there was only Alina and Damien, only love and hope and the promise of forever, only two souls who had found each other across centuries of loneliness and would never let go again, no matter what darkness might rise to challenge them in the days and nights to come.